took off on January the 1st, 1945, to attack Allied airfields in Holland and Belgium. Most were Me-109s and FW-190s, including many D-9s carrying bombs or drop tanks. Sweeping across the northern sector of the Bulge, the German fighters then turned to the west and headed for their target airfields. Damage caused to Allied bases was slight. German losses, however, were catastrophic. 300 fighters were shot down and 237 pilots killed, among them men of very great experience. By the end of March 1945, Soviet forces had reached the Oder. The Germans now deployed their rapidly diminishing forces on the Eastern Front along the River Line, in the hope that they could defeat the final Soviet offensive to take Berlin. Alongside the tank and infantry forces of the Army and Waffen-SS flowed in men of the hastily raised Volkssturm formations. Soviet military strength by this stage of the war, and in readiness for their offensive, was overwhelming, and the German efforts merely a forlorn hope. It was against this dire backdrop that surviving Jagdwaffe formations, in this case flying very late Model 109s and Langnese-Doras, hauled themselves into the air from slush-covered runways to attack Soviet forces. Following the crossing of the Rhine and the Battle of the Ruhr, P-47 units functioned almost exclusively in the fighter-bomber role. Although designed as a fighter, the Thunderbolt had been adapted to fulfill the close support role with great success in Italy. Over Normandy, the P-47 gained a formidable reputation in this capacity and was greatly feared by German ground troops. Razor-backed and bubble-top P-47s are seen armed with 500-pound bombs mounted under wing, together with a centre-line drop tank. These Thunderbolts are preparing to leave a forward base to strafe targets in support of US ground forces advancing into central and southern Germany. Along with the RAF Typhoon, the Thunderbolt was to emerge as one of the two premier fighter-bomber types used by the Allies in the European campaign of 44-45. However, by this time the Luftwaffe had been virtually driven from the skies by the Allied air forces. By this period of the conflict, the Martin Company's originally despised and much maligned B-26 Marauder medium bomber had proven itself in combat. Indeed, by 1945, the B-26 had the lowest loss rate per sortie of any of the US bomber types. In the closing weeks of the war in Europe, Marauders operating out of former Luftwaffe bases were engaged in bombing raids designed to reduce the ability of both the Luftwaffe and the German army to continue military operations. On the 21st of March, the Allies began attacking every Luftwaffe airfield from which an aircraft could operate. By this time, the bulk of the surviving Luftwaffe formations had been consciously committed to the Eastern Front. Nevertheless, the Americans and British continued with air operations against any target of military value right up to the German surrender. In addition to airfields, bridges, railway sidings, junctions and troop concentration areas were also hit. One of the primary targets of the heavy bombers right up to the closing days of the war had been the synthetic oil refineries upon which the German war machine so depended. Indeed, perhaps no other target proved to be so detrimental in terms of its consequences in preventing the Luftwaffe from functioning. The Allied bombing supporters had been fundamentally in error in believing that heavy bombing could reduce Germany's war production. Oil supply, however, was always the Achilles heel of the German war economy. Filmed by the US bombing survey after the war, these synthetic oil refineries proved to be the premier target in the Reich. In the face of a declining fuel supply in 1945, ground crews on Luftwaffe airfields were forced to fall back on muscle power to move their charges. Other heavier types required teams of oxen, the measure of how bad the fuel situation in Germany had become. For Thunderbolts and other Allied fighter types ranging across Germany, the only remaining targets were those of opportunity on the ground, presenting themselves to be strafed. All over Western Germany, the results of their handiwork could be found destroyed and abandoned in their hangars across numerous airfields. The occasional Luftwaffe fighter still made it into the air. This FW-190D9 has only moments to live as he's harried and finally brought down by a P-51 Mustang. Its destruction symbolizes that of the whole Jagdwaffe. Adolf Galland had been inspector of fighters for the most traumatic years of the short life of the Luftwaffe. When reflecting upon those whom he'd led, he summed up their achievement with the simple observation, "Our aces fought until they were killed."